Hi, my name is Jonna and I play football for Chelsea FC and for the Swedish national team. And you are listening to the Blue Day podcast.
So, fellow Chelsea supporters, we are back for another interview with the great Harry Harris on his memories of Chelsea Football Club. Of course, the first interview we did was in regards to the books of the Chelsea Revolution and how Chelsea changed from the spring of 2003 to the summer of 2003. Now we're going to talk about some books in particular, but also events and news that occurred throughout that time of Chelsea's history. In particular, we are going to talk about the 96-97 season, and we're going to roll on and talk about Vialli's season when he was in charge of the 98-99 season. So to begin with, welcome again to the Blue Day podcast. How are we?
Yeah, fine on this wonderful morning. I've got my diary full of events I'm going to this evening, and deciding which restaurant to book, usual.
Your diary's the same as mine, then.
Yeah, that's why I'm sitting here talking to you all day.
Well, let's get started, shall we, Harry, if we can. Let's go back. I want to sort of go back to the summer of 96. Of course, it was Euro 96 at this point. England national football team was doing fantastically well. And
Can we actually go back there? That'd be lovely.
that would be nice, wouldn't it? I'll freely admit, back when times were much more, much more nicer, shall we say? No COVID around, and I think life was a lot easier back then, wasn't it?
Okay, well, take me back metaphorically then. I'm happy with
that. Obviously, English football was changing massively around the summer of 96, and the likes of the Bosman ruling, of course, changed a lot of things when it came to footballing transfers. But in regards to Chelsea in particular, Ruud Gullit was there as a player, first season in 95. He then got the position as head coach from Glenn Hoddle. In the media's terms, what was the reaction of having Ruud Gullit become the Chelsea coach from Glenn Hoddle? Was there sort of a much of a shock around that? And what was sort of the inkling from your point of view how it would go?
Well, my guess was that Chelsea fans thought the only way that Ruud Gullit was coming to Chelsea was the fact that his knees were all shot to pieces and he was getting on a bit, and they didn't probably think this was the real Ruud Gullit. It was probably coming along as a bit of a stunt, or maybe for half a season, or I think they're probably baffled by what was going on. But in my job at the Daily Mirror at that time, travelling around and going to European games for a variety of reasons, I was watching Ruud Gullit at that time, and of course he did have his knee problems, but he was one of the world's greatest ever footballers, and to watch him playing for Sampdoria or Milan, you just saw a greater player he was. And of course, coming up to the Euros and Holland, you think of the great Dutch teams of that era, and of course, Ruud Gullit won the Euros with Holland, captain of Holland, magnificent specimen of a footballer, but not just any kind of football. He played as a sweeper, he played a creative midfield player, he played as a centre forward, he could play on the wing, and you wouldn't notice any particular difference in that. He was just sublime wherever he played. He was the epitome of Dutch total football. So for me, coming to Chelsea, coming to English football, my immediate thought was this is going to be worth watching. So I was determined to turn up for the first game. I played against Everton, where he played as a sweeper, and I was determined to see virtually every game I could. I also wrote my first of 4 books about Ruud. and that was a biography of him. It really is almost impossible to imagine what the world in this country and football was like back then. But I went to all the top publishers, and eventually one of them actually said to me, "Look, unfortunately, books on black people do not sell." And that surprised me a bit, but, should I be shocked? But anyway, I did find a publisher who was willing to take it on, and it was a massive bestseller. And I followed Ruud, meticulously, as I said I was going to. That was my intention. And listening to him and speaking to him, and he got to know me in all the press conferences. Those days, the morning papers after the main press conference would have a session with the manager and one or two players, but it was a very intimate one, in the corridors, and less of the regimented press conferences you get now, more of getting to actually know somebody, and in a very small group. So eventually he knew who I was, and I told him I'd written a book about him, and he was very conscious of his image rights, and he discussed all his contracts with Ken Bates in the terms of Netto, and it was the first time I think in this country when anyone had heard of that, but we got to know it quite well after that. But I said to him, "Look, I've written a book about you, but it won't detract from your image or your image rights or your commercial rights, whatever it is." Not that he was worried. He was earning a fortune, and earns a fortune. I said, "I'll tell you what will happen is eventually you'll be writing your autobiography." And of course, I came to him with an offer for his autobiography, and he said to me, at that time, he was playing into his golf and he was enjoying his leisure time. He was going around London. He really enjoyed it and didn't really want to take time. I said, "Look, I'll tell you what, you give me 4 1-hour sessions and I will write your autobiography." And he said to me, "That's not possible." I said, No, I've written a lot of books. I will do that. 4 hours, 4 sessions, 1 hour each, and it's done. And he said, "Okay, I'll do that." So he would come to our flat. My wife and I lived Elm Park Garden, 500 yards from the bridge. So after the training, I'd come to the club, doing whatever he had to do for a limited period of time. Around about 5 o'clock, he would pitch up at the flat. And we had a massive, great big green sofa, remember it, green and white, green and dark green striped sofa, but it was a huge one. And he sat on there, and we started talking. This was the first 1 hour session. Round about midnight, the wife saying, "Is he ever going to leave?" Once he started, he could not stop talking, and
Wow.
It was fascinating to listen to it. And eventually, midnight, I think we just said, well, I could be up early, Oh, it's midnight already, I've got to go. So he walked down to the bottom of the flats, and he walks out of the flats, and he was obviously heading back to, he was going to walk, I think, because he wasn't far away. He lived in Chelsea as well. And you could see, we went on the balcony, you could see a few people going, "Nah, it can't be." But it was Ruud.
They just had to have a look at just a second time just to go, "Really? Did he just walk past us?"
And he did.
Brilliant. I mean, obviously, I was a bit sort of too young to remember when Ruud Gullit took over, but I remember, obviously, as I sort of became a Chelsea fan, the amount of enthusiasm Chelsea fans had because of this Ruud revolution that was sort of taking shape at Stamford Bridge. But Chelsea obviously appointed him. Were there anybody else in the pipeline that you might have remembered that Chelsea were obviously talking to as well? Because the names that I read on your book, and I was doing a bit of research as well for this interview, the likes of Terry Venables, George Graham, and one Arsene Wenger. Was there any truth to the rumours?
Well, I spoke to Ken Bates about it at the time and since, and you know what Ken's like. I'm telling you. But yeah, of course he's all like sounded out 1 or 2 people. And I think Ken being Ken thought to himself, well, first of all, I probably need an experienced manager after Glenn Hoddle's gone to England. I didn't really want him to go, and it was a very short period because they still thought he was going to stay. You know, Matthew Harding was very close to Glenn. They liked each other, and he was propping up the club financially and was making great progress with Glenn about a new contract. But I think they underestimated how much of a draw England was for Glenn Hoddle. But I think it made it perfectly plain if England ever came along, he would go. But they thought the contract was so good he would stay, but it didn't. So clearly they sounded out one or two people, but you know the value of managers at that time was escalating, and I think Ken thought, "Well, that's a bit steep," you know. And he also had Ruud Gullit on massive wages as a player, and he thought, "Well, here's a clever thing. I can have a manager and a player, and not you know dish out on a manager." And don't forget, you know, without Matthew Harding, and even with him, the club were going through tumultuous financial issues at the time. So I think Ken thought that was a clever idea, and I think what clinched it for him was that the fans, you know, there wasn't no social media there, but they got wind of the fact of all the managers that were being linked with the club. And I think in the last game, they were all chanting for Ruud, and they wanted him as the manager. And I think Ken Bates thought, well, all right, you know, if he's that popular. And I think he was, because as we talked about going back, wind the clock back when we first started the discussion, what they must have thought was going to turn up. But if you watch that first game against Everton, when he played as a sweeper and was the best player in defence, best player in midfield, the best player in attack, you think, hey, hang on a minute, this is something special. You know, it's probably the best player that the club's ever had in its entire history.
Back to Glenn Hoddle, if I can. What did the relationship break down between Glenn Hoddle and Ken Bates at the point that Glenn took over? Because I can imagine, obviously, with what you've told me about Ken Bates, the last sort of two interviews we've done, that Ken Bates obviously weren't happy, as you've mentioned just now, that Glenn Hoddle was going to take the England job. Did the relationship become fractured between the two?
Well, with Ken Bates, it doesn't take a lot to have a fractured relationship, does it? Come on.
No, that is a good point. That is a good point. With regards to Ken Bates itself, sort of at this point, you know, it's been sort of discussed about his relationship with Matthew Harding. What was the relationship like at this point, you know, when Ruud Gullit took over?
Well, I would say that probably Matthew Harding was slightly more on board with it because, you know, he was a fan and fans were backing Ruud, and so he'd be backing Ruud and he'd be saying to Ken, you know, that all the fans are behind him. We were all like, you know, why were we looking for something else when we got it already here?
Yeah. Obviously, Gullit coming in, he would have his own idea on players, and one came in sort of quite early was Gianluca Vialli. Came in, he won the European Cup with Juventus. How significant of a signing was that for Chelsea?
Huge. Again, you know, a world-class footballer, centre forward, full of goals. But again, you know, not at the peak of his career, but you know, a bit clever for English defenders. You know, there weren't a lot of foreign defenders then, so a bit clever for the kind of level of defenders, even the foreign ones, that were in English football at the time. So a huge signing, I think. Big personality again. But they were great mates. You know, they played in Italian football for a long time together. They, you know, it would have been something that Ruud would have particularly wanted. And without Ruud Gullit as the manager or a presence there, I can't imagine Luca Vialli would have looked twice at Chelsea.
Of course, they signed Roberto Di Matteo as well. They signed Frank Leboeuf. I mean, these players, nowadays, Premier League clubs, they go all over the world to bring in a foreign imports. But again, back in 96, a little bit unheard of that all Premier League clubs would look at abroad rather than find somebody from the English Premier League. What was the excitement like, if you remember, amongst Chelsea supporters, and what in the media, how did they see Chelsea's chances of success in that 96-97 season because of the signings they made and with Ruud Gullit now in charge?
Well, I think it was almost like a bit of an experiment, and I think the media were interested to see how it would work out, probably very sceptical. But you would gravitate to the club to find out what was going on. And it wasn't just the English press, the world press were gravitating to Stamford Bridge. This was the pre-Abramovich era, but it was as exciting. Probably more so because none of these players were costing an awful lot of money because they were at the end of what was their fantastic careers, but nonetheless, still right at the top when they came to playing English football. So it was an experiment, and it was certainly working in terms of entertainment. I mean, it was just wonderful to watch the Chelsea football team at that time with so much talent in it.
I think the one game that sort of springs to mind as well when you say that was the FA Cup tie against Liverpool of January 97, when Liverpool, I believe, were 2-0 up, and then Chelsea just sort of rampaged them forward and then obviously won the tie 4-2. Was you at that game covering it for the newspapers?
I think you'll find I was.
You was there.
I think what was so interesting about it was that none of these players were interested in kind of the methodical style of football. Even the Italians that were coming in, they blended in very well with the kind of like super attacking footballers they had, and it was never going to be a dull game. They were always going to be attacking. Invariably, the ball was played forward. Not that they didn't have good defenders. Marcel Desailly came there. They had some great goalkeepers, fantastic fullbacks who could defend as well as attack. So they were quite astute as a defensive team, but they always were looking to go forward, and it was just a joy to watch. So who wouldn't want to go and watch them?
Of course, that season as well, with the excitement of the new players and, again, Ruud Gullit becoming the coach, obviously there was massive sadness, and obviously the news that Matthew Harding tragically died in a helicopter accident coming back from a game. I believe it was the League Cup tie against Bolton, wasn't it? What was your sort of memories of him? What was he like? Again, people sort of I've spoken to in the past have told me how passionate he was of Chelsea, but just obviously for your memories, how big of a Chelsea supporter was he? I know he was a director at Chelsea, but just sort of sum up sort of your best memories of Matthew Harding, if you can.
Well, I've got to set the scene really, because it's in context. You'd understand this. But at that particular time, and I've had my ups and downs with Ken Bates, as you know, he's banned me from the club after investigations, which got the club a record fine at the time. I've had 2 High Court cases with him. I've been in the dock twice in High Court cases with him. But at that particular time, we were the best of friends. It was incredible. You'd be hard-pressed to experience anything quite like it in life, particularly in football, but certainly in life as well. So at that time, we were going out together. My wife and I were going out with him and Susanna on a regular basis, and we were very close. But, I'm going to set the scene. I was the chief football writer of the Daily Mirror. My mission was to find out what was going on. You couldn't do much better than sit down at an Italian restaurant or upmarket restaurant with Ken, getting down a few bottles of Chablis Premier Cru, and Sancerre was his favourite tipple, to find out what was going on with it. So with Matthew Harding, obviously, you were either in his camp or not. And, other journalists were more, Ken Bates didn't deal with them. They dealt with me mostly. So they would gravitate to him, knew him better than I did. But I've had quite fascinating episodes with Matthew Harding, because, of course, he would have liked me. He'd like to have wooed me to come over to his side, to the publicity machine that he was building up against Ken. But I had Ken on my back all the time saying, look, this is what he's saying about me. What are you going to do about it? So it was a bit difficult. Matthew and I would pass each other in the corridors at Stamford Bridge, and there were some funny looks going on, But he did, very polite, and we did speak quite a bit. But I can't profess to have known him that well in the light of the situation that was going on.
I see.
And of course, I'm very sad that what happened to him. Obviously, I mean, from what I saw of him and talked to him, you couldn't. And I did talk to him quite a bit. You couldn't help but like him. But he did have his issues, and he was a bit strange at times. And you probably know those issues as well as I do, so I don't need to talk about him now. But I was a bit of an investigative journalist at the time as well. About the Chelsea thing we talked about, and I investigated other people, as you know.
For me, I'd just like to remember the guy, who was passionate about Chelsea, and just how I like to see him, a fan in the boardroom.
He was, but a very wealthy one.
Yes.
And had a lot of influence because of that wealth, because of the loans he'd given to the club, and the new money, in addition, he was going to put in for development of the stands and all that sort of stuff. When the club were going through a financial crisis, he was a very powerful figure.
The game after the news that broke out about his death was Chelsea-Tottenham on the October the 26th, 1996. Was you there at that game? And if so, what was, guessing the mood was a somber one at the Bridge that day?
Yeah, I mean, of course it was. But, generally the fans only know of the perception of people and their reputations and what they're doing. And we've had so many icons of the game who have passed away recently, or even at that time. The fans feel deeply about it. And it was a somber mood, no question about it. But, not much more you can say about it. It was very sad when it happened.
I want to talk about Zola later on, because obviously, of course, you did a whole book on the magician that was Gianfranco Zola. So I'll sort of talk about him just sort of briefly later. But
I have his shirt signed up there. You can see it.
I can. Yes, I can. Yes, that was.
He played in his last game, and I've managed to get the shirt signed.
Fantastic. Was that the game against Liverpool in 2003?
If you say so.
we shall leave it on that. I want to sort of fast forward onto that season. Again, I was reading the book a lot for the last sort of week or so, and one thing that sort of caught my attention was it seemed as if, you mentioned it just quite previous about Ruud Gullit and Gianluca Vialli's relationship being a strong one, as they both played in Serie A. They knew each other sort of on and off the pitch a little bit. But while I was reading the book, it seemed that all was not well between the two. It seemed that obviously Gullit was, brought Vialli in, and it was a case of Vialli was the leading marksman. But at times, Vialli was on the bench a lot, and Vialli didn't sort of take that too kindly. Was there a bust up sort of brewing and that occurred between Gullit and Vialli that season?
Yeah, there was. I thought it was fascinating. Tales of Luca Vialli having a cigarette on the sidelines when he wasn't being picked, or having a drag in the dressing room or whatever. He was. It was. You can imagine these two very, very laid-back characters who were great friends, played golf together, had a great time together, falling out, It was fascinating to watch, but, interesting.
Because there was one sort of description, the fact that Ruud Gullit was on the touchline, Vialli was on the bench, and Vialli wanted to be quite far from Ruud Gullit because he just didn't want to be anywhere near him. So it was a case of Ruud Gullit was on one side of the subs bench, Vialli was on the other, right on the other side. And it's quite fascinating to sort of read that and sort of, try and picture yourself maybe at the stadium at the time. Maybe Chelsea fans might not have seen it, might not have realised, what was going on. But to sort of read it sort of back all these years later, I found it was fascinating that, as you say, two big icons of the game And as you say, similar egos, and what led to it obviously had a falling out, and it did, I think, affect the team sort of going forward, because there was obviously some Chelsea players that were for Gullit, some players probably was for Vialli.
Yeah, no, there's no question about it. But, the Dutch mentality is quite fascinating, because they have a fallout at the drop of a hat. Ruud Gullit's had his fallouts as well. He walked out of the national team for a World Cup. I was actually there at the press conference when that happened.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So, they're not adverse to a bit of a, and to walk out of a World Cup when you're the country's best player, that takes something. But he did, on a point of principle, and I know why he did it. It was fascinating to see. But, as a manager, Ruud Gullit was evolving as a manager. He was not an easy manager. You look at Alex Ferguson. I'm writing a book about Alex Ferguson this year. He was not an easy manager for some players. He was a hard taskmaster. He'd give his players both barrels at times. You couldn't mess around with him. You couldn't mess around with Gullit as he was evolving as a manager. And we all recall when he went to Newcastle, he dropped Alan Shearer.
Yes. For the big game against Sunderland, I think it was. I believe it was his last game as well, that he puts Shearer and Duncan Ferguson as well on the bench, I believe.
It was either Shearer or Gullit. It was a pretty big shootout up in the northeast, because they loved Gullit, taking them to the FA Cup final. You know what they thought about Alan Shearer.
Yeah,
don't drop Alan Shearer.
That's right.
In a Newcastle, but he did. Mm-hmm. And I remember speaking to him the day before he was going to do that. We discussed what the implications would be. And he said, I know. He said, I know, I'm going to do it. I kind of...
Do you think, sort of based on what his experience at Newcastle, and obviously how that, with all due respect, maybe didn't go too well for him? Because I know the expectations when Gullit went to Newcastle, it was a case of, he's going to try and transform Newcastle to where Chelsea was. So he would bring in the foreign imports. They would have, success in cup competitions. Obviously, it didn't work out to that extent. Do you think that may be one of the reasons why Ruud Gullit never got another job in England, or he sort of maybe fell out of love with English football at that point?
Ooh, well,
because me personally, I find it fascinating that I thought he did well at Chelsea. Obviously, we're going to talk about later on, the issues he had with Bates and obviously his dismissal. And then he went to Newcastle. It didn't obviously work out brilliantly for him. And then that was it. There was no more sort of jobs for him in English football. And even sort of beyond that, I know he maybe took charge. I think one notable team, he took charge of LA Galaxy, but that was, years later. Did he sort of fall out? Do you believe he fell out of love with English football after the Newcastle stint? Because I remember reading once that he didn't like the press too much. He thought that he kept being hounded by the press, and he wasn't getting, enough alone time with him and his family, and all he kept doing was telling the press to go away. Was those sort of factors part of it, do you believe?
No, I don't think any of that. I mean, that was kind of like impression at the time. I don't think that was the case. I mean, I think Ruud Gullit is a complex character and it's hard to read. So I don't think I have a definitive answer. But if you're asking for my personal opinion, I think he was keen to get back in management, and he went off and he did more of his badges, and he studied more, and he wanted to be a manager. I don't think he was given the right kind of, they now call it project. So he didn't quite get the right club.
Yeah.
And I don't think he was cut out to go to Oxford or Rotherham or Middlesbrough, or he wasn't cut out for a small time club. He was a big time personality. If AC Milan had offered him the job, I think he'd have jumped at it.
Yes.
Maybe if Feyenoord had offered him the job. You never know. But I just don't think, for me, had he won the cup final with Newcastle, I think the fans would have said, oh, well, if he wants to drop Alan Shearer, good luck to him, get on with it. But the results took a dip. He dropped Alan Shearer, didn't work against Sunderland, and off he went, and I think he was a bit wounded by all of that. And I think also club chairman are thinking, you know, high maintenance, high price, and didn't go anywhere, you know. And you've got to be very pragmatic and look at it as well. How many black managers was in English football at that time, or indeed now? Mm. So, you know, you've got to look at a great deal of prejudice that was going on.
Well, people are still talking about it to this day. And, you know, as you say, what has changed in regards to black managers in football?
Nothing.
Mm. Ruud Gullit did lead Chelsea to the FA Cup final in '97. Yeah, that was the game that made me a Chelsea fan. That was that particular game. It will live, to some Chelsea supporters, it will live long in the memory. I'm assuming, again, forgive me for my assumption, was you there at that game covering it? And you was there. Describe, if you can, the importance of this cup triumph for Chelsea, and you know, do you have any stories to share of that day? You know, both as a football supporter and as a journalist.
Well, it gave my wife a great deal of pleasure being a Chelsea fan. That's all I can remember about it. But you know, it's a job. I'm paid to be unbiased, to write about the final. You know, I'm concentrating on what I'm doing, but. Ruud had an interesting, when I wrote his autobiography, had an interesting take on it.
Okay.
You know, it was like, it was the first trophy Chelsea won in 26 years. Yeah. That's a quarter of a century. So you can imagine how delighted all Chelsea fans were. But not only that, it was the first black manager ever to win a trophy of any type in English football. He was the first foreign manager to win a trophy of any type in English football. I mean, talk about glass ceilings and breaking them. He broke them all.
Yeah.
And you know, he told me he put the FA Cup final cup down on the grass, and he pointed up to Ken Bates. Said, "There you go. You know, well, I've won for you." But he also said, you know, and he experienced this at the highest level of clubs, Chelsea, but Milan, you know, big clubs. And he said, you win something, and all the owner and director thinks is, yeah, next season I'll win twice as much or 3 times as much. And they expect so much more. And he said, that's what happened to Chelsea. They just expected so much more. And it's so hard to deliver time and time again, particularly with limited resources, particularly at a club like Chelsea. But they don't care. They want more and more and more. And the expectation is more. The demands on you is more. That's what he thought there was the reason why, you know, he was sacked. But, you know, I heard from Ken Bates other reasons, more about, you know, about the contract, negotiations over the contract. But, you know, they seem to be going okay. But there was also some private issues. And I told Ruud Gullit about one of them. He was oblivious to it. But it rankled very much with Ken Bates. And he felt he'd been personally snubbed. I won't go into details about why. It's pretty.
No, of course, I understand that.
Petty.
I understand that.
I've written about it in one of my books. Well, I think you'll find it in one of my books. And there was an accumulation of those 3 factors, I think, because you know, when he got the sack, you know, also that first leg against Arsenal, and he was a bit lazy in the way he attacked that ball in the air. In so much he's, you know, a big man, like he could have got it. You know, it skimmed off the back of his head and Arsenal scored. And it didn't look as though they were going to recover. They hadn't played very well in that first leg. They sacked him straight away, but, you know, they were still in that semi-final. They were in everything else. And Vialli, complete novice, takes over exactly the same team and became the greatest trophy winner in the club's history over that small period of time, basically with the same team.
Yeah, Vialli won the trophies, but it was, in essence, Ruud Gullit's team. Look at it like that. But just last on the 96-97 season, before we do move on to, obviously, 98 and 99, sum up Chelsea's season of 96-97 for you personally? Did you see it as a success for the club going forward, or did you see it as, I mean, league terms, they didn't finish near the top four at all. I think they might have finished sixth for that season. But did you see it as a positive season for Chelsea?
Well, I think everything that was happening at that point, even the negatives were a positive, because, it was just a fascinating soap opera that was going on there at the time, with huge global names. You just thought, wow, Chelsea was the place to be for all sorts of reasons. But I think the problem really is that if the owners want more and more and more, the fans do as well. They think, wow, what's next? What are we going to do next? What happens is, as he said, common sense really, the expectations level rise far beyond the reason. That's the main problem.
So that was the Ruud Gullit book, The Chelsea Diary. If you can find it online, I do urge Chelsea supporters to find it. It is a fantastic read, and it's got obviously stories about Chelsea team doing the recording for the FA Cup final song with Suggsy. It's got in-depth sort of game by game from that season as well. So it is a great book. So I do urge Chelsea fans to try and find it if you can.
That's not going to be easy, is it?
It's not going to be easy, but I'm sure there's an avenue to go down with that.
At the time, and now I would say of all the 80 books I've done, that's probably the best-selling book I've ever written. It sold 60,000 copies.
Oh wow!
And I doubt whether and I know people. It's probably more of a collector's item now, and I've seen it out there. It sells for an extraordinary amount of money. Though certainly, if you can get a pristine hardback copy. So the moral of that is, you should go and buy my present books. One day they'll be worth thousands. Yes,
we will talk about you. We will talk about your present books soon. But one person we didn't mention from the 96-97 season who came in, £4.5 million signing from Parma, was Gianfranco Zola. And, of course, you did a book covering the impact he made, not just to Chelsea, not just the Premiership, but English football in general. Again, that book, if you can find it at a good price, I do urge you to spend the money. It's a great book. The first thing that got me while I was reading this book was the fact that it wasn't just Chelsea that were interested in him. It was another London club in Tottenham were interested in signing Zola. Was there any chance that, again, looking back now, that Zola could have maybe signed for Tottenham rather than Chelsea? Or, was that more of a case of this other team's interested, so hurry up and sign this player?
I think he was always going to go to a place where he could recognise all the players that, he had played in Italian football. I don't think he had much knowledge outside of Italian football, personally. And why would he? But he'd seen players who played in that kind of style of football, and they were at Chelsea, and it was the natural thing for him to do. I couldn't have seen him signing for anyone else, but other clubs would have been interested. But they'd know more about Zola as well because of all the Italian connections. So I think it was pretty much a certainty.
Was you at Zola's news conference with him and Ruud Gullit? You was. Yes. What was that like?
Fascinating. I think they had to get Zola a cushion. No, great, really. I've seen Zola playing for Italy and in Italian football personally in certain games. It was, you knew what a great player he was. So he was only going to enhance what was happening at the time at Chelsea, and he sure did, didn't he? What a great player he was.
Yes, he was just a fascinating player in regards to he could maybe play. Again, now looking at it more in detail, he could have played as a striker, he could play as a 10, he could even sort of drop deep and maybe play out wide. He was a for me, a fabulous player. And he also, look, again, as a Chelsea fan, every time he got the ball, you didn't know what to expect. He was one of them sort of magicians on the ball.
Defenders. So, I mean, at the time, I think he was obviously deemed to be Chelsea's greatest ever signing. And that's saying something, considering with some of the players we've been talking about. But now, since then, there's been some, after the Abramovich era, you've had players like Eden Hazard. I mean, how would you compare Zola to Hazard?
Difficult. I would say, for me personally, I would say Zola was better at set plays. I'd say, I'd rather have Zola take a free kick than Hazard, personally. But Hazard...
You learned his free kicks from Diego Maradona.
Yeah. And I just feel that, again, Zola, people have comparing him to the greatest players, as you say, like Hazard. And I still feel that although those two are a little bit similar, I still feel Zola sort of offered a little bit more in regards to overall game. And yes, Hazard would change the game just like that. But again, this is probably being biased because I grew up watching Zola, as a Chelsea fan. But I just feel Zola offered more as a footballer.
You've had players like Didier Drogba have been so instrumental in that era of success. Frank Lampard and players like that, So although Zola was deemed to be bloody hell, look at the player we've got now. Since then, there's been some huge talents at Chelsea. It'd be hard pressed to pick out who would be the best now, I think.
I would say that the one player who, when we signed him, I thought was definitely like a Zola type player was Juan Mata. I felt that when we signed him and how Juan Mata played, I thought there was a lot of characteristics that I thought reminded me of Zola. And, even now, I'm still gutted that we sold him to Man United. But I just felt that if we obviously had Mata for longer, he would have been that type of Zola player. He would have been maybe the role model of the team, the guy that would drag the team from, defeat all the way up to victory.
Well, yeah, indeed. Fascinating.
What was your interactions like with Zola? What's he like sort of off the field? Was is he sort of like, because I've heard stories that he's one of the most charming individuals you can ever come across. Was he like that and much more? What was your dealings with him?
Like that and much more. He came from very humble beginnings and he was always very humble and he was always a very nice guy. Yeah. I mean, genuinely a very nice guy.
Again, as a sort of journalist, it was quite fascinating that Zola was named Footballer of the Year in '97 and he wasn't even there the full season. How deserving do you feel he was of that award?
Well, I voted for him.
Yeah.
By far the best player that season, yeah.
And just for, sort of finally, before we do move on to the next book, but where would you rank the signing of Zola for Chelsea compared to the others? And sort of not just sort of the others since Roman Abramovich, but others sort of in that sort of era of the late 90s to early noughties. Because for me, I thought it was one of the main catalysts for Chelsea going to the next level.
I still think he's the best player I've ever seen in a Chelsea shirt for me. And there's been some phenomenal.
There's been some big players, yes.
But I just think he was just magical in some of the things he did. Like Hazard, but he could do it even better sometimes. Like Mata, but he was faster and could score more goals. And clearly, dead ball was just superb to watch. But he could conjure certain things that I just think he was quite an extraordinary player.
Well, again, his book, if you can find it online or if you can find it from a decent bookstore, I do urge you, because it is a great book to know about, Zola, the impact he had on the Premiership and on Chelsea Football Club in the late 90s. So try and find it if you can. The last book, and this one did fascinate me, so we might go sort of in the weeds a little bit here, Harry, so I apologise in advance for this. The Vialli diary, and this covered the 98-99 season. Now, sort of moving on a little bit from Ruud Gullit's era, what were your memories of the 98-99 season, covering it as a football fan and also as a journalist?
I just think Chelsea had such an interesting team to watch because it was hugely attacking football, skillful football, and they collected so many trophies along the way. Particularly, watching them in Europe was wonderful to see. Those teams were every bit as good as the teams that cost billions to put together. And some of the players came relatively cheap, but it was a quality of football that I enjoyed particularly.
Mm. The season before the 97-98, you're referring to when Chelsea, did win some trophies. We won the League Cup in the final against Middlesbrough. We had a fantastic sort of journey in the Cup Winners' Cup when we beat Stuttgart in the final when Zola scored, I think it was his first touch when he came on in that final. But of course, Ruud Gullit left with Gianluca Vialli taking over. Did touch on it a little bit earlier, but just for this particular context, what was the reaction from the media of this change and the fact that Chelsea were doing quite well in the league as well in that particular season? Was there massive shock, or in your opinion, you more, I could see this coming?
I don't think anyone could see it coming so early in the season. I think it was a bit of a shock, and I think the media were fascinated to try and find out what was going on. And there were so many different reasons being thrown out there, and I think you just accepted the fact that the briefings were that there was a big breakdown over the negotiations on the new contract, and this great phrase "netto" emerged, didn't it? And so it was wonderful headline news for weeks. It was good. It was a good place to be to watch the football and the drama behind the scenes. It was fascinating.
Did you hear at the time that the relationship broke down before this decision was made? Did you sort of maybe hear rumblings maybe weeks sort of beforehand? Or again, was this a case of 1 minute everything's rosy, the next minute he's at the door?
No, well, obviously, because of my relationship with Ken Bates, I knew months before.
Right.
There were rumblings of discontent.
Right. Just for clarity, was it to do with maybe transfers maybe coming in, players sort of trying to come out, or any issues with player power or anything like that?
I think it would surprise you what the issues were. As I said, I can't remember which one, but I think I've touched on it on one of the books.
Okay.
And if you've read them all very carefully, you'll find there's an extraordinarily unusual reason that was added to the mix.
If it's the book that I'm thinking of, then I did read it. We're going to touch on him now. Why do you think at the time Vialli was the chosen one? Because it was, looking back, it was maybe a bit of a risk to have maybe another, player manager at that time, because obviously it happened with Gullit. Could there have been maybe a chance that Chelsea could have gone for a more experienced manager at that point?
I think Vialli was appointed for the same reasons Gullit was appointed, but with a more firmer belief that it would work, because the big risk was Gullit to start with, player manager. Then he wanted to become manager, not player manager anymore. That was the big risk, but it worked. It was phenomenally successful to a point, and they thought, well, if that structure worked, player manager, worked there. Let's do it again. Yeah. So I think there was less of a worry. It was so much of a risk, still a risk, but less of a worry because of what happened with Ruud. So it was also the finances. We're paying him already, so them get on with it. And they knew that a large proportion of the dressing room probably felt sorry for him the way he'd been treated by Ruud. So it didn't seem so much of a risk, I don't think, as it might have done for the fans, as it was in the boardroom. So the boardroom, Ken Bates really decided they would agree with him.
That's fascinating. So I'll just go a little bit sideways just for 1 minute. In all three of the books that we've sort of touched on today, and I've gone through in detail the last week, one man's popped up continuously, and that's Graham Rix. Now, in the late 90s for Chelsea, he was obviously part of the backroom staff. How big of an influence was he in the dressing room for Chelsea, do you know? And even to the club itself, because it seemed that, he was part of Ruud Gullit's backroom team. He was then part of Vialli's backroom team. And he, based on sort of the books that I've read, he sort of seemed to really sort of gel the sort of, how can I put it mildly? He sort of gelled the relationship between manager and players. He was that sort of buffer that if, any players had an issue, he would go to Rix, and then Rix would obviously then go to Gullit. What was your dealings like with Graham Rix, if you had any, and what do you think his importance was to Chelsea Football Club at that time?
Yeah, I mean, I've known Graham Rix many years when he played for Arsenal. I was there in that cup final when he missed his penalty. Everyone remembers his penalty, but Liam Brady also missed a penalty in the same game. And I've known him many years. And he is influential in so much as, he's a great footballing talent as a player, and a great, he was a good coach. And he had the ear of the players and, as you say, acted as a buffer. But, the real influences there were the managers and the chairman. There was not a lot of grey,
right,
with a grey beard. He was in charge, and he wanted to know what was going on in the dressing room. People might be telling him what's going on in the dressing room. But nothing's changed. That happens in modern day game. But the big powerhouse at that club at the time was the managers, but more importantly, the chairman.
I get it. It does fascinate me while talking about Ken Bates, because again, as a kid and even a teenager, I had this sort of image of Bates or how he was as a chairman, and then obviously speaking to people like yourself, some of it's changing, some of it's not. When you sort of discuss with Bates and the fact that he wanted to know everything that was going on, first team and everything else, did he have, say, for example, snitches in the Chelsea camp and such, so if a manager perhaps maybe had an idea, but, it wasn't sort of going to come across yet, did somebody, for example, then say to Ken Bates, oh, this is what could be happening, for example, or was there nothing like that at all?
I think there was a lot of that.
Right. I see.
But it's.
I'm not saying it's a bad thing. Again, for me, it's fascinating because I sort of see Ken Bates as this particular guy, and again, he's been successful as as an owner, and he's done fantastic for Chelsea. And I'm not knocking him at all, but I just sort of have this little vision of him, in the boardroom, and he wants to know everything, and based on sort of reading the books, the fact with him and Ruud Gullit's relationship obviously breaking down, I just sort of see this image of him maybe having some snitches in the camp, telling him certain things that maybe the manager or whoever didn't quite work like that. Didn't work like that, right?
So if you want to know how it worked, you really need to speak to Gwyn Williams.
Gotcha.
And I'm sure he won't tell you.
No, that's probably not. No, probably not. To be fair, on the Blue Day podcast, that name has come up before. Let's just sort of move on. Let's just sort of go sort of more to that season. The signing of Marcel Desailly, again, we sort of discussed about the signing of Vialli, signing, Desailly, who, in the 98-99, he won the World Cup for France in 98. This was a huge signing for Chelsea. But how big of a sort of coup was this to sign Desailly for Chelsea?
Well, it was part of what was happening at the time. These guys were attracted to the club because of the quality of the players that got gone there. They were all fascinated to see what was going on. And even clubs like Man United didn't have that kind of attraction. It was kind of like it was sold quite simply. Look, you're going to be in a dressing room full of these great players that you know about, you've played with times, you've played against, only in your leagues you've played in. You have a rapport with them. They're speaking the same kind of football language as you, that kind of football. But you're also going to be playing in, and living in London. It rains in Manchester all the time. The sun shines in London. Where do you want to be? And it was as simple as that. They could pick and choose, but they're coming to the end of their careers. They still had a few years left, and in English football extended that because of all the reasons we've talked about. But Jurgen Klinsmann used to drive around in a little Volkswagen around London, and he loved being in London. Why would he want to go to Manchester if he was coming to English football? I want to experience English culture in London. I don't want to, be stuck at home because I can't go out because it's pissing the rain every day. I want to go.
Yeah, that's sort of something. I think that happens sort of still now. I think if you look at the top players, again,
to a degree,
probably not as much as it was before. But obviously,
if Pogba wants to go and experience life in London, that's fine. But I don't think the London clubs are going to pay him £500,000 a week. Things like that.
Certainly not. I don't think they would sort of pay 80 to 100 million for him either. I can't see that. Now, in this particular book, what caught my attention that it was announced that the Cup Winners' Cup was going to be axed at the end of the season. And it was it was for the purpose of expanding the Champions League, the amount of teams that would go into the Premier European competition. This was to thwart plans of a European Super League that was discussed in the late 90s. Now, roll on 2021, and where there's still talk of a breakaway European Super League. The fact that there was talk about this in the late 90s and there's still talk about this to this day, do you believe this will ever happen, or do you just believe this is one man's crazy dream that is going to stay a dream?
Well, I mean, funny enough, I discussed this at great length with Ken Bates at that time, going back all those years. And he said, look, do we really need FIFA? Do we need UEFA? Because what are they? They're just little, they set themselves up with an office in Zurich and they run the game. But now the clubs are running the game. And since then, we've had an association of European clubs, and we have an association of European players, and we have association this and association of that. But the upshot is very simply this, and the Champions League is, in effect, the European Super League breakaway. That's what it is. So, you can't have a breakaway. You can't have that breakaway from UEFA and FIFA in particular, because the players want to play in the World Cup. Now, if you break away, all of they say is fine, do whatever you want, but you will not play in the European Championships, you'll not play in the World Cup. So would those players forsake that to go into a European Super League? They might get a few more bob, but they get so much money anyway. I don't think they would. They want to play in World Cups. Ken Bates said, well, we get shot of them and we form our own World Cup.
Okay, interesting.
That was his theory. But the thing is, that takes a lot of organisation, takes a lot of, aggro. But, they had it with the breakaway of the Premier League. They could see it could be done. And that's what he advocated. He wanted to get rid of FIFA and UEFA and set up now we have a European Association of Leagues, but he wanted to set that up and run the world game and organise a World Cup.
That's interesting.
But I don't think he could carry anyone to take all that burden on.
Yeah.
And so you let FIFA run away with it, all the corruption we've seen as a result of it. And he said, well, we could eliminate all that corruption by just running the world game ourselves.
Mm.
But, as you said, 80 to 90% of all the players in the World Cup, certainly the tail end of the World Cup, all play in Europe. They don't play in Africa. They don't play in Australia. They don't play in America. They play in the powerhouses of Europe. You only need to carry those, and you've got the World Cup.
That's fascinating. With Vialli's time as manager, obviously we discussed about Ken Bates. Did Vialli's relationship with Bates ever turn rocky this particular period, or was this sort of later on towards Vialli's sort of, dismissal back in 2000?
I think Vialli was a completely different animal to Ruud. Ruud was more aloof. He was playing his golf. He had his social scene. He had his girlfriends, and he had his social life. And Vialli played golf as well. He used to play with Ruud. He was more amenable to whatever his chairman was interested. He had an Italian mentality to football, where the owner and the chairman was to be totally and utterly obeyed and respected, and you did what he wanted. And I don't think Ruud had that kind of mentality. He thought the manager and the top players were the essence of a football club, and he'd seen how it'd been run in Italian football, and how you were always battling against the owners. But here, there was a different way of going about it. And I think Vialli was able to adapt much better than Ruud was.
Right. This particular season as well was pivotal, for a young man by the name of John Terry. He made his debut for the club, albeit from the bench, against Aston Villa in the League Cup. What has been JT like as a person, and what was he like to interact with for you? Obviously since the time where he's been club captain, he's won Premier Leagues, he's won a whole host of trophies. What's JT like as a person for those that maybe have never had the pleasure of meeting him?
Well, he wasn't an easy person to get under his skin, to find that out, actually. But what I would say about John Terry is, he, from early on and right away through his career, he was hugely respectful. And he came across, as someone who was respectful of the people who owned the club, respectful of journalists who wrote about the club, respectful of identifying with the club. So he would always be in a club blazer and the tie, and well turned out. I think he was a massively influential captain of Chelsea.
Could you see him obviously with what happened to Frank sort of this year, but could you see John Terry return to Chelsea as a manager one day?
Well, I think everyone's going back to Chelsea one day. I mean, it's a turnover, isn't it? I mean, you might get the job one day.
Oh, well.
Well, obviously that's what he wants to do. And I think he was very, personally, knowing him, I think miffed when Frank got the job ahead of him. And I think he took a more realistic path to becoming Chelsea manager. Learning what it's like to be on that, involved in all of that. And he's doing that at Aston Villa. It'll be interesting when he gets his first job. And I think he's taking more of the path of one or two other players who know they need to experience at management, to lead them to where they want to end up. And I think John Terry's taking that path. And it's a slower path. He's got to be very patient about it. But, I think he'll get there in the end. But the problem he's got is that, and this is why I probably miffed that Frank got to the job first, is that Abramovich has never appointed an English coach. Frank was the first. And after the experience with Frank, it could well be the last. Because it's not that Frank wasn't potentially going to be good at the job. Abramovich wants ready-made players, managers to give him instant success. And his view is, well, if I'm paying £250,000 to start the season, I expect to get better return than I've got. Yeah. And despite what Frank achieved last season with no new signings and how he galvanised all those youngsters, it was refreshing to see. But you always thought, well, when Frank gets his own team and he gets the signings in, it'd be a formidable new Chelsea, and it wasn't. Unfortunately, it just didn't work.
There was discussed, obviously, John Terry that sort of came into the side in the 98-99 season. One player that was in the side that was bought by Chelsea in the summer of 98 that didn't last long was Brian Laudrup. Now, It was interesting reading back on the notes, and I've sort of looked at internet sort of, columns about Brian Laudrup's time at Chelsea as well. I just want to sort of ask you, Harry, if I can, how do you feel Chelsea was disappointed that this move didn't work out the way it wanted to? And looking back, who do you believe was to blame for the fact that this move, Brian Laudrup's time at Chelsea only lasted a mere 2 to 3 months?
Perhaps they got the wrong Laudrup. No, I think it happens in today's game. You look at Chelsea. We just talked about £250 million on all these new players, and a couple of them have come in, like a Brian Laudrup. Gifted players, wingers, great reputations. You see clips of them, nutmegging 3 players and going on and scoring a goal. And they come along at Chelsea, and thus far, it's like, wow, they're the same bloke. Sometimes it isn't easy. So you get a lot of success rates, and we've talked about all of those, the Drogba's and the Zolas, Hazard, all different people. But sometimes it just doesn't work. Sometimes the character just doesn't adapt. Can't adapt to the style of football, can't adapt to the pace of the game, can't adapt to the style of the game, and their game just doesn't adapt. And maybe that was the case. You can't pinpoint it. I mean, why wouldn't such a great talent have hit it off? But sometimes even better players than him, Shevchenko, who was the greatest goal scorer in European football at the time, greatest goal scorer in the Champions League, just didn't score enough goals. He did score goals, but just not enough, and wasn't consistent and looked out of place. How was that possible?
Yeah.
So it doesn't always work.
No, that's true. One striker, obviously we talk about Shevchenko, but one striker that came in, unfortunately, he didn't have the success rate he could have had, but it was to do with injury, was Pierre Casaraghi. Obviously, he picked up a career-ending injury against West Ham away. Some Chelsea fans I've spoken to about this, when I've spoken about the 98-99 season and how Chelsea were successful back then, I've spoken to them about Casaraghi and that particular season, and a lot of them have said to me that if Chelsea were brave enough to bring in a replacement for Casaraghi, they felt Chelsea could have won the league that season. Do you agree with that assessment, or do you feel that Chelsea were right to, hold fire a little bit and wait until, the time would come to maybe get someone else in? Because again, sort of looking back and reading your book, it was a case of, seeing what would happen later on down the line. But a lot of the times, Chelsea didn't have enough funds in the bank to, buy somebody else.
Well, I think that sums it up. Sometimes it's not just a question of, this would be a great idea. Casaraghi, for me, was one of the best centre forwards you're ever likely to see. He had it all. And it's a shame again. He was at Chelsea at the end of his career. I mean, but it depends if you've got the finances, what the clubs, there's so many factors other than just, that would be a good idea. Let's just go and get a good player in. But that point of the season, it isn't always easy. Funds are difficult. Let's wait till the end of the season when you've got more of a choice and, they're not been asked premium prices. There's so many factors come into it that you can't say that this is what they should have done. From the outside, yeah, of course you would. It's easy, but it's not so easy when you have to do it.
Of course. Harry, just a couple more questions before I do eventually let you go today. One bit in this book that it did make me smile, and I had to sort of read it a couple of times. According to reports, Chelsea were interested in taking Les Ferdinand on loan, allegedly, as part of, with Casaraghi being injured. However, there was a rule in place for Premier League clubs. Do you remember what this particular rule was?
No idea.
Apparently, allegedly, Premier League clubs were not allowed to loan each other players.
No.
So now, could you imagine that rule being in place today? that a Premier League club could not buy somebody else on loan? That would be interesting.
There's quite good merits in that, isn't there? Because very recently we saw a case where, was it West Brom and West Ham, Snodgrass, was it?
That's right, yes.
But they had a side agreement where, okay, we'll loan you to him, but you can't play him against us.
I think Snodgrass was bought, though, wasn't he? I think that was different.
So was it another player? I mean,
no. I think that the story that I heard.
Oh yeah, they bought him.
They bought him, but they had an agreement.
It's even worse when you're loaning players because then you have more. Your parent club has more control. So there's a great deal of potential for abuse.
I remember when Chelsea signed Scott Parker from Charlton in the January 2004. And when we were playing Charlton, this was about February time, Parker didn't play. And it wasn't a case of Parker was injured. It was a case of the clubs both had an agreement that Parker would not play against Charlton that season. And when I was looking at that, and then I was looking back on sort of other incidences linked to this, I found it fascinating that, some clubs could have that potential gentleman's agreement that in certain quarters is allowed and certain quarters it's not.
That's why it's open to abuse. But also I think that rule it's a long time ago, and there's so many rules. Maybe it was that you couldn't loan between the clubs during the course of the season. And the loan structure would happen at the end. So it could be done with more time so they could see all the paperwork and they could see all what was going on. And it's more open to abuse during the season because, if your mate, your son might be managing the team and you might say to him, like Darren Ferguson did, could you loan me half of your reserve team during the course of the season so I can get out of relegation? Okay, no problem. There you go. Sort that out. It's certainly open to abuse, and over the course of the years has been abuse, and maybe they just brought that in, and then they change it, because the paperwork is tighter. There's so many shenanigans go on in football, as you can imagine.
Yes,
it's hard for the authorities to keep pace with the next big thing in doing something, circumventing the rules. So doesn't surprise me.
Harry, just finally on the sort of 98-99 season, what was your assessment of sort of Chelsea that year? Do you feel season climax that Chelsea could have won the league, and do you feel overall that the amount of sort of signings that they made, the amount of money they spent that season, the fact that Chelsea didn't win anything, do you feel that was a particular failure for the club that year?
Not particularly. No, I think that's probably how it was viewed at the time, as we was talking about. The more success you have, the more you want, and then it's pretty hard to take when you don't achieve it when you think you should, and that's why managers come and go so regularly.
Well, Chelsea did reach third that season, and they'd obviously got Champions League football for the first time. So I think that yes, there might not have been a trophy, but the fact that Chelsea did reach the Premier European competition, I've sort of looked back on it. Okay, they were disappointed against Real Mallorca in the Cup Winners' Cup. They lost I believe it was 2-1 on aggregate. They didn't do well in the League Cup and or the FA Cup, but I thought overall it was a progressive season. The fact that they brought in new players and a lot of players went out. So I personally thought it was a constructive season that probably helped the next season by winning the FA Cup in 99-2000. Personally, that's my opinion. Anyway,
no, you're probably right because it's now become more accepted. Probably not so much at that particular time, but if you finish in the top four and qualify for the Champions League now, it's accepted at the top clubs as far more successful than winning any domestic cup. So you could go the season without winning a trophy, but point about it is you qualify for the Champions. That's the place to be.
Yeah. Just finally, Harry, before we let you go today, and you can enjoy the rest of your weekend, just for the Chelsea listeners that perhaps like to buy your book more easily accessible than the ones that we're discussing, just sort of tell us about your sort of recent Chelsea book that you've written, and sort of more details about it. So if anyone wanted to buy it, they could.
Yeah, it's called The Boss, and it's a history of their managers from Alex Stock to Frank Lampard, and we've just updated it with a chapter about the new manager, and we've left some space in case there's a manager after him. But of course, it is they've had some fantastic characters, and we've talked about a few of them as managers at the club. But
yes,
I enjoyed writing it, and I interviewed a lot of the players in each generation and each manager and each segment, and get an insight about what their managers were like. And it's been a hugely successful book. I'm still hoping it's attainable. I think there's a few copies left. But in 10 years' time, if we're still talking about this, you'll be paying an absolute arm and a leg for one of these copies of this book.
More than likely, yes. Absolutely. Mr. Harris, it's been a pleasure to have you on the Blue Day podcast today. Thank you very much for your time. But it's been a pleasure to have your insight on Chelsea in the late 90s.
Anytime.
Fantastic.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.